A 13-year-old boy was forced by a court order to spend Thanksgiving with his father. He never came home, and for years, that same father sat on national television crying for cameras, begging for information, performing grief for an audience of millions, while investigators quietly built a case that would expose exactly what kind of man he really was. This is the story of Dylan Redwine, and it ends with truth, even though it took a decade to get there. Dylan Redwine was born with a wide smile and a stubborn streak that made the people who loved him laugh. He was 13 years old in November 2011, living with his mother Elaine in Vallecito, Colorado, doing the ordinary things that 13-year-olds do. Playing video games, texting friends, figuring out who he was going to become. He had his whole future stretched out in front of him like something unwritten. His parents had divorced, and the split was not a peaceful one. Elaine had concerns about Dylan spending time with his father, Mark Redwine. Those concerns were not abstract. They were specific and documented and serious. But a family court had made its ruling, and the law said Dylan had to go. So on November 18, 2011, Dylan boarded a plane in Durango and flew to spend Thanksgiving with his father in a remote area of La Plata County, in the mountains of southwestern Colorado. He was never seen alive again. Elaine reported Dylan missing on November 20th, 2 days after he arrived at his father's home. Mark told investigators that Dylan had simply walked out the door on the morning of the 18th, hours after arriving, and never came back. He claimed he woke up, Dylan was gone, and he assumed the boy had just wandered off somewhere. He waited. Then he waited some more. By the time law enforcement was involved, critical hours had already passed. The search began immediately. Volunteers, helicopters, search dogs, the kind of coordinated effort that rural communities pour everything into when a child goes missing. They searched the rugged Colorado terrain for days and found nothing. Dylan had vanished without a trace, as though the mountain had simply swallowed him whole. And then Mark Redwine did something that, in retrospect, should have told investigators everything they needed to know. He went on television. He appeared on national programs with his eyes red and his voice breaking, asking the public for help finding his missing son. He sat across from anchors and hosts and looked straight into cameras and talked about how much he loved Dylan, how desperate he was to find him, how he couldn't imagine where his boy had gone. He gave interviews. He made appeals. He became a fixture in the coverage of his own son's disappearance. People who have spent careers studying killers who insert themselves into investigations have a phrase for this. They call it the performance of grief. And Mark Redwine performed it with commitment. Meanwhile, those who actually knew Dylan were not impressed. Elaine, Dylan's older brother Corey, and the friends who had known the family for years, they watched those television appearances with growing unease. Something about the performances felt wrong. Something about the story didn't hold together. A 13-year-old boy doesn't just walk out into a remote Colorado mountainside at dawn and vanish, not without help, not without reason. Investigators continued working the case. They searched Mark's property. They interviewed neighbors and acquaintances. They examined his timeline and found gaps that couldn't be explained. And they looked at his computer. What they found on that computer changed everything. Among the files recovered from Mark Redwine's devices were photographs. Deeply disturbing, degrading photographs of Mark Redwine himself. Images of a nature so humiliating and so bizarre that the details shocked even experienced law enforcement personnel. These photographs existed on the computer, and crucially, investigators came to believe that Dylan had found them. Think about what that means for a moment. A 13-year-old boy, already uncertain about spending time with a father he reportedly feared, arrives at a remote house in the mountains. At some point before he disappeared, he came across images that would have horrified and confused him beyond measure. Images that revealed something about his father that no child should ever have to process alone. According to testimony that would later emerge, Dylan had confronted Mark about those photographs. He had said something. He had made clear that he knew. And in that confrontation, in that moment when a frightened boy finally said the words out loud, investigators believe Mark Redwine made a decision that ended his son's life. The motive wasn't rage in the traditional sense. It wasn't a dispute over money or custody or some ongoing conflict. It was exposure. It was the desperate, cornered reaction of a man who could not afford for the world to know what that boy had seen. And so Dylan Redwine, 13 years old, armed only with the blunt honesty of a child, became a threat to be eliminated rather than a son to be protected. In June 2013, hikers discovered partial human remains on a remote mountainside near the area where Dylan had gone missing. The remains were confirmed to be Dylan's. The location was rugged, isolated, and not the kind of place a boy wanders to on his own. More remains were discovered in 2015, scattered across a wide area of the same mountainside, consistent with what happens to remains left exposed to wildlife and the elements over years. The physical evidence painted a picture of deliberate concealment in an area that Mark Redwine knew well. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones carefully. Among their findings was evidence of blunt force trauma to Dylan's skull, an injury consistent with a blow to the head. The kind of injury that does not come from a fall. The kind of injury that tells a story no father should ever be the author of. Mark Redwine was arrested in 2017, nearly 6 years after Dylan disappeared. He maintained his innocence from the moment investigators closed in on him, and he continued maintaining it through years of legal proceedings. His defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had witnessed what happened in that house, that the prosecution was building a case on inference and speculation. The trial began in 2021, a full decade after Dylan boarded that plane in Durango. A decade. 10 years of Thanksgiving tables missing one person. 10 years of Elaine and Corey carrying the weight of knowing and not being able to prove it. 10 years of a man who killed his child being able to walk around free, giving interviews, claiming victimhood, performing innocence. The prosecution methodically dismantled his story. They presented the photographic evidence. They walked the jury through the forensic findings. They brought Corey Redwine to the stand, and Corey testified about who his brother was, what their family dynamic looked like, and what it meant to spend a decade waiting for justice for a boy who never got to come home. The jury deliberated, and on August 10, 2021, they returned a verdict of guilty on 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of child abuse resulting in death. Mark Redwine was sentenced to 48 years in prison. He will be well into his 80s before he is eligible for release, if he lives that long. He will almost certainly die behind bars, which is where a man who killed his 13-year-old son to protect his own secrets belongs. In the years since Dylan's remains were found, Elaine has spoken about her son with the kind of fierce, protective love that never fully heals and never fully stops. She has said she wants people to remember who Dylan was, not just how he died. The boy with the wide smile. The boy who was stubborn in the ways that would have served him well in life. The boy who, even at 13, had the courage to confront something frightening and speak the truth about what he saw. That courage cost Dylan Redwine his life, but in the end, it was also the thread that investigators followed all the way to a verdict. There is no justice that restores what was taken. There is no sentence that gives Dylan back his future, his laughter, or the Thanksgivings he never got to have. There is only the record. The truth, finally spoken in a courtroom, received by a jury, and